Good evening, everyone. We're glad you're with us. I'm Lindsay Mills.
And I'm Lee Nelson. Thanks so much for joining us. We've been watching the president's response to the Mueller testimony before a couple of House committees earlier today. We'll get to that in a moment. First, were you among the millions of Americans glued to their TVs all day long watching the testimony of former special counsel Robert Mueller before the, again, House Judiciary and Intelligence Committees? Mueller dismissed President Trump's claims that his investigation had exonerated the president of obstruction of justice.
The report also said investigators did not find sufficient evidence to establish charges of criminal conspiracy between the Trump campaign and Russia. Mueller described the Russian government's efforts to interfere in American politics as among the most serious challenges to democracy he had encountered in his decades-long career, which included leading the FBI after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Mueller says election interference by Russia in 2016 was not an isolated attempt, and in fact, he told House members, quote, "They're doing it as we sit here." Mueller also frequently gave one-worded answers to lawmakers' questions and referred back to the wording in his report. Here now to talk more about the testimony is Chris Beam, an adjunct professor at the University of Southern Maine and someone who has spent 4 years at the National Archives processing the Nixon White House tapes.
So, Chris, thanks for being here.
Well, I'm glad to be here.
And I know you, as we have been watching the president speak, and we'll get to that in a moment, but first just wanted your take on earlier in the day. Basically, it sounded like most of the Republicans were saying the testimony by Robert Mueller kind of proved what they've been saying all along: no collusion, no obstruction. The Democrats, though, say, at least with regard to obstruction, there might be something there. Some are talking about starting impeachment proceedings. So it's still this back and forth. How did you take what happened there today?
Well, what struck me was the big difference between the current probe and the current controversy and the Watergate scandal. And there are significant differences. During the Watergate scandal, the Democrats were largely united, but the Republicans were very badly divided. And in fact, in the 1974 impeachment hearings, a number of Republicans went over towards impeachment, including the newly elected for a 2nd District Congressman, Bill Cohen. You don't see this now.
Right.
I think with one exception, all of the Republicans have sort of, drawn a circle around President Trump and are steadfastly defending him. That came clear to me.
Do you think for Americans it's clearer today what was in Mueller's original report after those hearings?
Well, I don't know if very many people have read the Mueller report. It's a big, thick tome. It's small print. There's lots of legalisms and so forth. I have not read the thing. I intend to at some time. But I think pretty much, my guess is that people are pretty much stuck in the opinions that they've already held. If they don't like Trump, if they think they ought to be impeached, or think at least he ought to be opposed, they're still there. If they support him or are willing to excuse him, I think they're still there. I don't think, and I'm not a prognosticator, but I don't think that public opinion has really shifted that much.
And again, we watched the president speaking his mind just moments ago. Do you think that's changing anyone's mind? What's your take on what the president had to say?
Well, Donald Trump has a radically different style than Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon did not go out on the lawn of the White House and have these impromptu press conferences. While Richard Nixon certainly was antagonistic to most of the press, as Donald Trump is, he didn't use terms like fake news. I don't think it was around. He wasn't really to point the finger at particular journalists or particular organizations and so forth. Donald Trump is not only willing to do that, I think he sees a political benefit in doing that. That didn't happen under Nixon.
Interesting. Yeah. Interesting. Well, we thank you so much for your perspective this evening. Let's move on to other things, shall we?
Yes. I think we're tossing are we tossing a break, Isaac?
All right, we'll just take a break and be right back.
Thank you. Maine has its first case of Powassan virus since 2017. That's according to the Maine CDC. A
person infected lives in southern Maine and is being treated at a New Hampshire hospital, and health experts say they believe this person contracted the illness in Maine. Cases of Powassan are rare, and as Chris Costa shows us tonight, they can be life-changing and in some cases deadly.
Yeah, that was in Boothbay. We danced up a storm. There's a lot of memories like that with her.
Susie Whittington remembers Lynn Snow as more than a successful watercolor artist. she was her mom.
I just look at her. I was like, yeah, there's Mom. She's so alive there, you know? It's like, oh. So she walked 3 miles a day. She had a saddle in the back of her car because she rode horseback on a regular basis. And so we're assuming that she was bit by a tick in South Thomaston on one of her walks or riding.
Lynn found a tick embedded in her clavicle. The symptoms they thought were Lyme disease turned out to be much worse.
And she started declining cognitively. I mean, within 12 hours, she was having trouble with some of her words. She was disappearing, actually, is what it really felt like, is she was disappearing.
Lynn's systems started shutting down. In 7 days, she was on full life support. Doctors told them it was Powassan virus.
So that's the diagnosis let us know she's not going to recover. And so that's how we lost her.
You had to make a very difficult choice.
They didn't make a terrible choice. My children, her grandchildren, you know, had this vivacious grandmother who was walking and, you know, walked 3 miles a day and rode horseback with them. How can something so small be so dangerous so quickly?
The Maine CDC says both the woodchuck tick and the deer tick can carry the Powassan virus. However, it's relatively rare. The Maine CDC says that there are about 7 cases reported across the U.S. each year, and in Maine, there have been 11 cases since 2000. But tick experts with the Maine Medical Center Research Institute say ticks are making their way farther north into Maine.
Knowing that the ticks are coming north, knowing that Powassan is on the rise is terrifying. It leaves us vulnerable. And I think that's part of the fear, is that we're vulnerable.
Now she's trying to teach others about this potentially deadly disease, realizing that in some ways it can be prevented.
She's pretty amazing. And I have to remember that balance, of living in the balance. I have to remember that I had her. And that's the most important piece. I had her.
That's Chris Costa with that report. Now, we are fairly familiar with the tips here. Wear long clothing, tuck pants into socks, wear permethrin, and don't go through tick checks, or go through tick checks when you come inside. The CDC says symptoms of Powassan can show up as very early, just maybe like a week after you get bitten. So it's just one more thing to be terrified of.
I know. Ticks.
Yeah.
Not good. We
No.
do have all those stories also at our website
Yes,
from
indeed.
Vivian's latest series on that.
Yeah.
All right, coming up, Keith is back with his full forecast. All right.
We're back.
It was actually perfect out there today.
Pretty nice. Early
Yeah.
clouds, but after that, now as I mentioned, we turn the corner and the rest of the week looks good. So we're going to get into this dangerous zone in which I don't have much weather to talk about, and you know how that goes.
Yes.
Oh no, what
It's
kind
like
of
the
stats are we
chances
going to
of
see?
me getting fired increase exponentially as the weather gets quieter. It gives me more time. But yeah, it's beautiful out there right now, and a couple of cumulus clouds have popped up statewide. But that's it, fair weather clouds that don't get all that vertical. One of my favorite cameras, Mount Katahdin, right now. You can see some of those cumulus that are not all that vertical. They're relatively flat here, showing you that we don't have a lot of instability in the atmosphere. So temperatures are comfortable as well, upper to mid 70s, some 60s still Greenville, for example, at 69 degrees, but we're right in that comfort zone. I think we're going to see that a lot over the next couple of days, although we start edging up to the mid 80s towards the weekend, but nothing, oppressively hot here for the next few. Hour by hour forecast overnight tonight, temperatures drop into the 60s, 50s eventually by early tomorrow morning. And tomorrow looks very similar to kind of the second half of today. So mostly sunny. A couple of the showers in the mountains of New Hampshire and the Lakes region probably don't make their way into Maine. And then we do it again on Friday. Looks pretty sunny through Friday as well, with just a few clouds in the afternoon, temperatures into the low 80s. And again on Saturday, nice weather through the weekend, really. High pressure builds in. It's all about the position of this high. It's kind of a nice direction for a high to come in because we don't immediately get hit in the face with humid air. It stays relatively comfortable, and it's not until this high shifts offshore, which is Monday and Tuesday of next week, that we start to get into that southerly flow that drags in that mid-south air that not many of us in Maine tend to enjoy too much. But we'll get through the weekend before we get there. So temperature trend here, again, looking pretty good. Upward for sure, but not crazy, and we should get to, upper 80s to around 90 on Monday and Tuesday. There will, guys, be a significant sea breeze this weekend, so if you're a beach person, I would maybe suggest going earlier in the day because the sea breeze, as you know, kicks in later in the day. Unless you like it. Unless you like the sea breeze, then fine. But it's going to be a nice weekend once again.
You survived.
Any questions?
Nothing
Yeah,
risky.
you didn't get in a lot of trouble
but I
that
got
time.
4 days like this that I. So,
Oh,
yeah.
there's
Dun,
time.
dun, dun.
Yeah.
Very good. We'll see you on News Center Maine at 5:30.
Good.
Keith, you're back with your brain drops.
It's a lot of me today.
A lot of Keith.
Okay, so we talk about things that are terrifying. Here's one for you. Flesh-eating bacteria has been in the news a lot
It has
lately.
been.
And what's interesting, this is the actual phrase for it, necrotizing fasciitis. But what's been interesting is it's generally a Gulf Coast thing. Thrive in warmer waters. But there have been some instances this year through the mid-Atlantic which has surprised some people because the thought was that it was too cold for it. The actual statistic on this surprised me. 55 degrees is all that the bacteria that causes this needs to survive. And so I wanted to compare that with the water temperature in Maine. I thought that would be an interesting little exercise. So as you can see, basically, except for Bar Harbor in this area out here, all of this water is technically warm enough.
Even though it doesn't feel like
It does
that
not.
warm.
68 is a deceiving 68, right? And 63. So this all exists, but you don't need to freak out about it. In fact, it's actually something you can get by eating contaminated seafood as well. So it's not just the idea of having a cut, getting into the water. But more importantly, and we're going to talk more about this tomorrow, we've talked about this. This is a dread factor situation, right? It's a scary thing that happens to people, no doubt. But we'll talk more tomorrow about the statistics, the chances of this happening to you versus other things that are more likely to happen to you but aren't as scary. So I'm going to try to bring you down from the ledge here.
You're going to put my mind at ease, that's for sure.
I'll try.
Let's
I shall
hope
try.
for once. News Center Maine at 5:30 starts right now.